on until he was older and he could understand. Here's this kid that's not only scared of this thing that had happened once, but he's got these brains chaotic from seizures, and no wonder he's freaking out. I mean, that's all he had. He didn't have the words to say, and that's really, really interesting. It's hopeful.
Well, and that's the thing that comes up for me with this stuff too, is trauma is so much easier to treat than a lot of these other symptoms. You know, if you're treating a symptom in isolation, sleep, if you're treating sleep issues in isolation, or A, it's a lot of medications if you were going to medicate every single one of them, and B, a lot of those symptoms are pretty stubborn, but treating trauma is easier to treat than some of the other stuff. So to me, there's a lot of hope, and kind of looking at it from that lens that families talk about as being more debilitating and more impactful on family life and everything else are symptoms that highly correlate with trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, we have the trauma that is shock trauma, which is the trauma that's related to feeling like your physical body is threatened. And then you have, additionally, developmental trauma. And developmental trauma relates to feeling threatened in your interpersonal relationships. As human beings, we are dependent on other people for our survival for about a third of our lives, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so a threat to your relationships, especially a threat to relationship with primary caregiver, taps into a survival place because that you have to stay connected to your caregiver or you won't eat. You won't have your basic needs met.
Okay.
And so when we talk about TSC, we're talking about shock trauma, but we're also talking about trauma in interpersonal relationships.
So it just seems like something that's worth ruling out. Your relationship with your caregivers and your family members are wired into survival. And all of those primary relationships impact whether or not we feel safe in relationship to other people, whether or not we can trust other people, whether or not we're going to be a people pleaser and like a super good kid to make sure that we get our needs met, you know,
yes.
Whether we're going to not notice when we're having needs so that we can not impose on anyone else, right? All of that kind of stuff. If you've got a kid who's growing up in a hospital setting and you've got siblings who are either going in for their own reasons or who are tagging along, that experience impacts all of those relationships because all of those people are learning to relate to one another in those experiences.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting how that impacts kind of a person's personality and also just their ways of adapting to how that has impacted their connection to their parent. I heard this beautiful definition of grief. It said grief is the loss of the expectation of relationship. Okay?
Ooh.
The loss of the expectation of relationship. And when you look at our society and, you know, what is it that people say when they're pregnant? They say, I don't care if I have a girl or a boy as long as the baby is healthy.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there is a grief in the loss of the expectation of relationship.
Yes.
We may have disabled kids in every public school in the country and in every city and every town. There are disabled kids, but there is not an expectation for that kind of relationship that is wired into to the possibilities that we bring to mind for families when they go about having a baby. Right?
Huh. Yes.
That grief is not the baby's fault. Our babies didn't do anything wrong by being born.
Right.
But we're not necessarily expecting that kind of relationship with our kids.
Right.
And that grief is going to impact the bond between the parent and the child because it's there. it's not because the child has done anything wrong, and the parent's not doing anything wrong either by feeling it, right? Because we're growing up in an ableist society, and we have to take responsibility for our own ableism and all that kind of stuff. But honestly, how often do people address it before it becomes kind of up front and center part of their lives? I wouldn't say most of us do.
No.
And then you also have the impact on the relationship. One of the things that I think was the hardest in our family was this issue of, I expected as a parent that I would be able to protect my child to some reasonable degree. Okay.
Yes.
I certainly expected to be able to protect my child so that my child wouldn't be having 15 seizures a day. And the hemiparesis honestly was
right. You did. I read that
really
in
hard.
Oh my goodness. Can you just elaborate on the hemiparesis briefly?
Hemi is half, paresis is paralysis,
okay.
right?
So
she was
okay, yes, you did
paralyzed.
discuss that. I'm sorry, I was thinking.
She could not move the right side of her body at all.
How could that not affect you? Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah.
I had this expectation on some level, and this is going to sound ridiculous, that my life was Probably a not. Steven Spielberg movie. Okay? And that I was going to be a Goonie, right? I was going to do the brave thing and the hard thing.
Yes.
And then we were going to find the treasure, and we were going to save our town and all that kind of great stuff, right?
Yeah.
That movie would have turned out really differently if one of those people had ended up lifelong disabled, or if one of those kids had died.
It's a constant reframing of your expectations. Yeah.
I thought my life was a Steven Spielberg movie, and it wasn't. And I thought also that when my baby was half paralyzed, my toddler, that society was going to care. And instead, I spent 10 to 15 hours a week fighting with Humana. And then they did not pay for the last 4 months of the year for her PT and her OT. That's 6 visits a week that we paid out of pocket. The reason we were paying out of pocket is because the alternative was to have a half paralyzed toddler stay half paralyzed.
Yeah.
For life. Right?
Which
is more expensive.
I can't imagine the customer service rep that had to listen to that, because that would have been a call that I would have been probably gone through the roof on.
But it wasn't going to be one call.
It was be one call.
Many
yes,
calls.
Of course.
And additionally, they were bumping back any therapies where she had PT and OT in the same day. It was always coded correctly. But they would bump back one of the bills and say it was a repeat bill. And I'd have, the 3 people on the phone to try and fight the situation. And the point is not all the medical details
right.
Whatever details. The point is that there was a trauma in the horror I witnessed of what happened to my child. And there was a trauma in my relationship with society and my family's relationship with society that demonstrated that they were indifferent to my child's safety. And what was happening in my family was scary and tragic. And I'm not saying there weren't wonderful examples of people who were counter examples to that. I mean, I just had lunch with her physical therapist that she's seen for 5 years. She's someone that has been a wonderful support through all of this. And there were a bunch of wonderful friends who were there for us. But there were some fundamental things where health insurance should protect half-paralyzed toddlers, and their community should come around and provide wraparound support, and there should be respite care, and we should have been able to get on some sort of Medicare, Medicaid. At the time, my husband was laid off.
Yeah.
We were paying Cobra while dealing with all this madness, and it was a nightmare. So I think all of that impacts siblings, and all of that impacts patients and relationships between parents and kids.
For sure. Constant stress.
Constant stress for something that is predictable. It's not a fluke to have a disabled kid. Should not make parents reinvent the wheel every time a disabled child is born.
Yeah.
Because it's predictable. It's about as absurd as if a community expected that when a baby was born, they would be a full-grown adult.
Yeah, and
Okay?
nothing bad would ever happen to them over the course of their life.
Right. Yeah. No, that's not, you're not preparing for reality here.
Yeah.
Reality is that children are going to have, we're going to have a certain percentage of kids who are going to be medically complex and are going to need extra care.
Yes.
We're going to have a certain number of kids who are going to have multi-system health issues where they're going to need specialists to have some way of talking to each other. We're going to have,
You're hitting on all the major gaps and problems in our system. And I think as a mom of any kid probably, I'd say in this day and age, you're going to run up against these things.
It feels really frustrating because a lot of times when we're talking about this stuff, we're talking about it in relation to the kid's diagnosis as though the diagnosis has anything to do with the lack of social support. It's not a diagnosis problem. It's an infrastructure problem.
It's a societal problem.
It's a societal problem.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I have lived that. It's terrible.
And that gets at a trauma that is more related to interpersonal relationships. And I think that's a trauma that you witness in parents and caregivers. And I think it also impacts how kids end up seeing themselves. Our neurologist is so wonderful. He's so wonderful. And he got into this field because he had had an experience with a family member, needed to see a neurologist, and therefore he got passionate about making a difference in families and kids. And it's not to say that all of those experiences make life, or it's not all doom and gloom.
Right, of course not.
And it's not to say that all of those adaptations are negative, but we need to be aware that not preparing to have a society in which a certain percentage of kids are disabled comes at a cost to people, to families, to the resilience of members of the community, and that we could do better with some better preparation for that.
Starts early in life. As a TSC mom and knowing the troublesome TAND component of TSC that is becoming more and more into the forefront as just based on our discussion now, where the system is becoming more complex, and as we try to care for our kids and go along, and then, they have behaviors on top of all the medical aspects, it breaking. And TSC is a place where, I think really is apparent. It's starting to become more and more apparent that something has to change. There has to be a better way to understand and treat these kinds of chronic diseases that are global in effect. And sounds like an overwhelming task incorporating it too with the societal problem, but I think that it all goes hand in hand. And I've just learned so much through this discussion. And as a TSC mom, what would your advice be to, a person receiving a diagnosis, then potentially as the behavior component, what would you recommend as far as your expertise?
There are a couple of things that I would say. I'd say on a trauma prevention kind of level, I'm going to mention 2 books, which may or may not be things that people are ready to read about, depending on if you're newly diagnosed and you're super triggered about reading about anything sensitive. These would not be books that I would put on the book list. If you're in a place where it's not as fresh and in your face, there are 2 books on trauma in children that I would recommend. One is Trauma Proofing Your Kids by Peter Levine and Maggie Klein. Another one is Trauma Through a Child's Eyes by the same. I think that is helpful.
Oh, that's great.
I think the only thing I would mention about that is that is not specific to medically complex kids. Those are books that are talking about Johnny with his one-time boo-boo.
Not the 15 seizures a day.
Not the 15 seizures a day.
Gotcha.
And so when you read about Johnny with his one-time boo-boo and you hear about him having to recover from his one-time boo-boo, there's a certain amount where you just have to be prepared
Yes.
for that.